Hello and welcome again to a very special edition of FAIRtax Power Radio. I'm Bob Paxton.
I'm Bob Scarborough.
And we are the FAIRtax Guys, and we've got a couple of special guests with us. You will probably recognize Steve Hayes, the president of Americans for Fair Taxation. We have him on here every now and then. Steve, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And we have also got John Richardson. We have referred to him several times here on the program. He's the attorney who specializes in helping people deal with the issues that come up when you earn income in a foreign country outside the United States. So, John, thank you for joining us.
Great to be back. Thanks.
All righty. And we're going to be discussing a case that will be before the Supreme Court. We probably won't get a ruling for several months. This is probably not going to generate a whole lot of interest in the press, which is why we're talking about it. So, Steve, while we're at it, just set the stage here. What's this case all about?
Well, it's an argument that, in essence, says what is income and when it can be taxed. Does it have to be actually received or in your control before it becomes income, which is subject to federal taxation, or can it be taxed when it's earned, even though you may not have realized it? For example, you own a stock that appreciates. Can they tax the appreciation, or do they have to wait and tax it only when you sell the stock and then the gain is taxed? That's the way it currently is. This case could have a big impact on how it's going to be done going forward. And I think that's really the essence of the case.
Okay, Bob, you may ask the next question.
Hey, well, let's review the history of the case. It's already gone through some of the lower courts where decisions have been made, and now it's before the Supreme Court. What decisions have the lower courts made on this?
And John, you take that one.
Wrote a brief, talk about it.
Sure. Well, basically, what's going on factually in the case is that the Moores were shareholders in a small corporation in India that was essentially producing, I think, some kind of farm equipment, et cetera. They were minority shareholders, I think 11% or something, no right to a dividend or anything like that. And as part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, a law was passed that basically said that a shareholder, as distinct from the actual company, was deemed to have actually received and been paid the earnings that were in fact earned by the company, even though they'd received nothing at all, and saying, poof, my God, you've got income you never knew about, and you have to put that income on your tax return and pay full tax on it. So basically, as Steve points out at the beginning, the issue here is, can you be taxed on income when you never received any income to pay the tax? And, as you might expect, there's been outrage over this. And the challenge began in the district court, and there were basically two challenges. First was that, well, if you never received income, how could this be income? So it must be a wealth tax, and therefore couldn't be rolled out the way that it was. And the second had to do with what I didn't say in my summary was that not only were you required to pay a tax on income earned by the company, but actually they went back 30 years in the past. So I mean, I don't, if that isn't retroactive, hard to know what would be retroactive.
Wow.
So the second issue was retroactivity. And, predictably, the district court said, doesn't matter if it's retroactive. And basically just seemed to say that, well, the company realized some income, even though it was never paid to the shareholders supposed to pay the tax. So no problem here. In other words, the Moores lost. It went to the Ninth Circuit's appellate court, which said basically the same thing. No problem with this at all. To their credit, the lawyers decided, well, this is an important enough issue, and it sure is, okay, because this goes way beyond the Moores and their little shareholding in that corporation in India. It affects all Americans, right? Because You know, if the issue is that all of a sudden the government can say, poof, let there be income, and there was income, even if you never received any of it, you know, this I think would be of great concern for Americans, and the Supreme Court has agreed to hear the case. The specific issue is under the 16th Amendment, which is the part of the U.S. Constitution that even allows for an income tax, okay? Under the 16th Amendment, do you actually have to have received money in your hot little hands to be taxed on it? Or can they just say, well, we're going to deem you have to have received the money. We're going to pretend you received the money even if you hadn't and make you pay a tax anyway. So that's sort of a summary of where we are on this.
Okay, so if you want to follow it, the case is Moore versus United States. I imagine there's a place online where you can look that up a bit. And John, you touched on this. Steve, let me see if I can get you to expand on this a little bit as to what the constitutional question in play is here. Because, you know, if there were no constitutional question in play, the Supreme Court wouldn't take it. So there has to be one here. What are they going to be looking at from a constitutional standpoint?
I think that, well, I don't know for sure because, as John knows, the court can go a number of different ways. But what I think all of us are hoping is that they'll take a look directly at the 16th Amendment and they'll interpret income in there, because the reason it had to be passed, an income tax had been tried before, it had been pushed down. They had to pass the 16th Amendment because the Constitution said you could only do a tax that was proportioned among the states. In other words, you couldn't do it directly on John or on Bob or Bob. 16th Amendment was passed, and it said you could tax directly on income. And what I think we're hoping happens is that the court takes a look at the 16th Amendment and says clearly, and this would be in line with past court decisions, actually from the 1920s, I believe John cites in his brief, that there are decisions which support the idea that you have to have it in your hands if you're an individual before you're taxed. And that's what I'm hoping the court takes up. Now, if they take up some little side issue, and it's not a little one, but retroactivity, whether it can be retroactive, or if they take up something saying that because they're taxing holdings in a corporation, that corporations are not as protected as by the Constitution for sure, and their income doesn't have to actually be received. Maybe they could go that way. I mean, I read an article today by a learned professor, of course, saying we really shouldn't change this case because we want to give Congress the full power to tax as they need to tax.
Ooh.
Can you believe that?
Okay. They ought to revoke his card.
And so, but basically, you have a situation where the bureaucrats are loving this because, you know, as John has pointed out, you can tax anything. Let's say that my exposure is increased by doing your show in other media, so I become a much more well-known attorney in my private practice. Well, that has a value. And some bureaucrat would probably tell me that increased the value, you know, $20,000, and you owe tax on it today.
Wow.
Okay. Or they could go to Bob Paxton's home and say, Bob, I understand you've owned your home a long time. You've been evading federal income tax for all this time. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, what was the price where you bought your home? And now what is the price of the home? And that gain, we're going to send you a bill for the tax.
But I'm still in the home. I haven't sold it.
But that's the implication that John and I are so concerned about.
Well,
Go ahead, John.
Let's say for a minute the Supreme Court says, yeah, they can tax unrealized income. You're going to end up looking at your portfolio, and the government is going to say, well, you owe this amount of money. Then immediately you're going to have to sell those assets at some level to create the cash to pay the tax. and it's a downward spiral from there going forward. And if the home ownership piece comes in, my goodness, let's just say I still lived in my parents' house and they paid $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 for it back in the 50s. And now I'm living in it and it's worth $750,000 or $1 million. Not that it does, because I'm not in my parents' house. But the point is that, people are going to be upside down and never be able to return to an upright position because of this. If it happens, I can't imagine at this point in the thinking about it that the Supreme Court would fall on that side of the decision.
Remember, they are unelected bureaucrats who came out of a system that was government almost entirely, and they actually are very empathetic with many parts of the government, and they desperately do not want to defund the government in any way. I don't think that's enough to make the constitutional issue go to where the Ninth Circuit said it should go, but it's still concerning because they breathe the air in DC. People say, well, why do people, when they get to DC, suddenly think they're smarter than everybody else? And I said, it's either the air or the water. They live there. They drink the water and breathe the air. So they're going to be in the contagion of that whole thought. And that bothers me.
It is a concern. And another question that comes up too, relative to the fair tax, and here we are talking about changing from income to consumption. Right. Is there a way to shine light on this our cause through the next several iterations of this case as it makes its way to the final decision of the Supreme Court? Is there an argument that's being made for the defendants that the income tax is flawed from the very beginning?
John, you want to?
Sure. Well, I think that this is a great moment for fair tax, right? In the sense that for most people in the world, taxes, one, it's theoretical, it's complicated, they can't understand, and they don't want to think about it. So as much as people hate taxation, I think it's very difficult to get people to concentrate on reasonable tax reform. But in this particular instance, what really is at stake is whether there are any limitations whatsoever on what the government can simply call income, whether there's any limitations at all. And I think it's important to recognize that, as the world has evolved, not only in the United States, but in Canada, I think most other countries, the tax code has become the main organizing principle of society, right? It affects how people save, how they invest. It creates opportunities for people. It diminishes opportunities. It's certainly, as I think we've seen recently in the United States, subject to weaponization, et cetera, et cetera. So the income tax, its very existence, I think, creates a lot of problems. And what the Moore case does is it shows how this really comes close down to the average person on the street. And once people understand that income tax systems are subject to this kind of incredible abuse, right? Literally just making up income and forcing people to put it on their tax returns, essentially confiscating their assets, if they're forced to sell. Once people realize that, hey, this is now too close for comfort, I think it's a great moment, to argue that income taxes, by their very nature, by their very arbitrariness, really, really should cease to exist. And the taxation should revert to what it was originally intended to be, that is a way to fund government, not to run people's lives and punish people. And so I think it's a great opportunity for fair tax to make the case for why the fair tax is the way taxation should exist in the United States. And I think that there's likely to be a much more receptive audience.
Right.
All right.
Folks that are that don't have amassed savings, either through investments or land holdings, et cetera, or jars of money in the backyard for that matter, they have an opportunity to say, well, the folks that don't have the big savings, but they may live in a house that's appreciated a couple of $100,000 over 20 years that they've been living in, and they say, wow, this could really, I mean, I might have to sell my home, or I might have to sell my land to pay this.
Right.
If you own 100 acres somewhere and it's been used for hay or cattle grazing or some sort of crop, you've got the state or the county taxing that property at an agricultural level as opposed to an urban or a residential level or a commercial level. The folks that are living in their home next to me, for example, or myself, we could be saying, hey, and this is everybody in the country that owns a piece of property. All of a sudden, we're looking at having to make a decision based on what the government says our appreciated value of that property is.
Right. And let me make it even worse. I wrote an article a few weeks ago that talked about what I believe the game plan is for the IRS, which is they're now coming up with a free tax preparation software. You know, they stabbed in the back H&R Block and the others into it by, even though they'd heavily lobbied Congress went ahead and let the IRS set up this free service, which takes income directly out of their hands. They have also, there's a commission to study, which says that within the next 4 or 5 years, with AI, artificial intelligence, they're going to be able to actually compute the tax return for all of us on the phone, on the show, and send us a bill. So you don't have to do your own tax return anymore, the 75 to 85% they estimate they can do. So take it even further and say that the Supreme Court dodges this one and leaves it like it is, and Congress decides, well, there's an immense amount of money out there in Scarborough's house that we need to tax. They just send you a tax return that shows how much you owe, Bob, and they take it off property records and who knows where else.
Right.
And now you're going to have to fight that.
Can I send them a piece of paper that says I'll owe you this when I sell it?
And then they send you a piece of paper saying they're going to put a lien on it and foreclose.
Take it, and then they'll take it.
Yes.
So we're on this downward spiral of no return. If we have to start selling assets, cash or investments or our homes or land that we have scattered around to pay these taxes. This is a very important case, as we've all said.
Right.
Now, the big question here is, why is it important that we look at this? The case is not likely to generate a lot of interest in the national media, and thereby folks will not have.
But they will not see this as a consequential case, because the talking heads aren't on TV every night talking about, like they were, well, gee, what happens if Roe v. Wade is overturned, or what happens if this challenge to the Second Amendment is overturned? This is not likely to generate that kind of discussion. So people need to understand, even though it's not generating waves in the media, why is this important to them? What happens if the Moors win? What happens if the government wins? You guys take that away for a while.
John, you want to go first? Yeah.
Okay. Another way of looking at this is that if the government succeeds on this, right? In other words, if the Ninth Circuit decision is upheld, what it really does is converts the U.S. tax system from an income tax system that's based on, we're going to tax you based on what you've received, to a system we're going to tax you based on what you have. Okay, but we're going to call it income.
Okay. Let me ask you a question real quickly. What have we got now if the Supreme Court just leaves this alone and we stay with the current system, does the current system tax income only when you get it, or does the current system currently let the government, just impute income to you and tax you on stuff you haven't got yet?
Shall I go with that first?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay.
I interrupted you. Go ahead. Sorry.
No problem. The current system is a hybrid system that primarily taxes people based on when they receive something to pay the tax with. In other words, primarily realization. But there are instances where the government will tax you based on what I would call fake income. In other words, you never really received anything.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly, these things apply disproportionately to American citizens living outside the United States. So I'm very familiar with them, obviously.
Yep, that's your wheelhouse.
Yeah. So, one of them would be, the expatriation rules. Okay. If you expatriate, they will want to deem you to have sold assets. In other words, you never really sold anything or made any change, but they're going to treat you as though you did, including non-U.S. pensions. I think I may have mentioned that before on one of our shows where, if you expatriate and you have a pension from, say, the University of Toronto, they'll actually treat the thing as completely distributed, right? So imagine, okay, that you all of a sudden, good morning, here's an extra $1 million for your tax return this year. Yeah, this is real.
Yes.
The taxation of non-U.S. mutual funds has elements of this, foreign trust, et cetera. So there are pockets of this. You see them, I think, mainly right now with Americans abroad. But I've got to tell you, if you look carefully at the Biden Green Book, you are going to see that they are proposing to bring a lot of these things right into the United States.
Right. Yeah. And Bob, if I can add to something that John was talking about that is really not just directed at overseas people, there actually was a bill, I believe, submitted that would start taking a Roth IRA. And you know what a Roth IRA is. You put your money in and it grows tax-free. It's not deductible when you put it in, but it grows tax-free.
Yeah, you fund a Roth IRA with after-tax dollars. It's not like a 401k.
Yeah, you've paid tax on. And what they've been talking about is instead of honoring that pledge for tax-free, it's not fair because some people have put in stock that greatly appreciate it. Like I think Peter Thiel from PayPal and from other things, I believe this is true, has like hundreds of millions, maybe $1 billion of value in a Roth IRA.
Wow.
And the growth doesn't get taxed. Now, the problem is that this bill even encourages more. Congress could say the earnings are taxable above a certain amount. But if this bill is allowed to stand, as the Ninth Circuit said, they could simply say to people having IRAs or 401ks or whatever above a certain threshold, and it'll start off high, then come down to where it affects everybody. Any gain you receive this year is going to be subject to this special assessment. Maybe it starts out at 5% or 10%, even though it's supposed to be deferred. But you don't have to sell it, but you're going to have to pay it.
Ask a question about that. Oh, go ahead and finish, and then I have a question.
And that's going to create a real pressure point. But again, I think all of us on this show have talked about that one of the purposes of the Internal Revenue Service, it has come to be used as John said weaponized, but as a way of controlling people. But I look at it as a great ATM for politicians, because if they threaten people like Peter Thiel and others in that group with this kind of a tax, what's going to happen to all the money coming in contributions the next day? It's going to zoom.
You're going to get a bunch of people trying to buy their way out of having to pay that tax.
That's right. This is a bad idea. They're going to get the best lobbyists they can get. They're going to go pay, tens of millions of dollars that end up in politicians' pockets. So, it's got ramifications all through society, because now they can, as John had said, have unlimited power to decide what they're going to tax, and they don't have to make you pay tax on it when you sell it. They can simply say, we're going to assess a tax on it. And every homeowner in this country has a potential problem. They don't like property taxes. How would you like your property tax to also be levied in the same way by the income tax? In other words, on appreciation each year. And you say, well, wait a minute, houses go up and down. Well, try to get it reassessed. And it's not always easy, right, gentlemen? And
there was a time in South Carolina when Myrtle Beach, South Carolina was growing, and you had 1 year you had a tax rate at a very low percent. You had your usual stuff that you have in the property taxes, and then the next year and 10 years later, it increased by a very large amount over a short period of time. My question earlier that still has some relevance in our path of conversation here is this. I've built a business that started in my garage, and now it's a publicly traded corporation. And over the years, I've been given by the board of directors as the founder and creator of the company certain stock options that are worth a considerable amount of money based on the great success of my garage idea. Don't you think that those folks like me in that situation would want to stand on the rooftops and say, you're coming after my unrealized gains of my options? I mean, we've talked about homeowners, but the folks that are in those positions are great and many in the public corporation world. And don't you think they would be standing on the side of what we would consider to be the appropriate decision for the Supreme Court?
I don't think there's any question they should be, but I have to caution you, why are all the huge companies not as vocal about it, perhaps this case and others, is that most of them are dependent upon government subsidies of one kind or another. Elon Musk relies on the tax credit for Tesla. He relied on a huge loan to save his company back when he took it over and was very small. And they, frankly, are a bit unable to be as vocal as they might. Now, Musk I admire because he still says what he thinks in a lot of ways. But you got a lot of those other companies that are really afraid. I mean, the big banks, all of these people are really concerned about being too vocal about attacking DC because they could get big problems.
If I have to go back, I'm the guy that has to go back and sell my house to pay the unrealized gain taxes on it. The banks are going to be in trouble too. Everybody, it's a whole interconnected web of responsibility in terms of taxes. And the way the economy is structured around the tax code, it'll be a big mess.
Huge mess.
It's something that you can't predict what will happen.
Gentlemen, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave that lie here right now, for we are slap out of time for this edition of FAIRtax Power Radio. We will continue this discussion next week with Steve Hayes and John Richardson. Again, thank you, gentlemen, for being with us here on the program, and we will see you again next week, and we will continue discussing this particular case. But until then, we are the FAIRtax Guys. I'm Bob Paxton.
Bob Scarborough.
Reminding you the fair tax is the only truly fair tax, and once you understand it,
you'll demand it.
So what would you do for her?
Well, we've got several programs that will help her. We just need to find out how much she makes. But the good news is, the less she does, the more we can help.
Yeah.
If I may, with the fair tax, we wouldn't even tax her income. So the more she makes, the more she has.
But still, a consumption tax could eat up a lot of her income.
Which is why at the beginning of every month, we're actually going to give back all that she pays in taxes on basic necessities.
You're going to give her back her taxes?
Every month, on everything taxed on basic necessities. But we're also going to give it back to you and to every American citizen.
Why?
Well, we believe taxes